On nature, indigenous knowledge, and the history of science. Okay. The work I had been doing over the years on what we might call systematic ethnobiology did not, of course, exist in a theoretical or applied vacuum. At the intersection of my interests in human ecology and ethnobiology was a constant awareness of the problem posed by the concept of nature. By the 1970s, nature was well on the way to deconstruction. In social anthropology, one thinks, for example, of the interventions of Marilyn Strathern, Carol McCormack, and others. In history, Keith Thomas and Lynn White. There was a growing tendency to claim that the evidence of cross-cultural comparison showed that nature was no more than a social construction, varying between one society and another. While there could be little doubt that in European history, economic and social factors had shaped the understandings and boundaries of nature over centuries of material and intellectual change. There were, however, equally persuasive claims to be made for the existence of similar cognitive imperatives in all human cultural populations, which underpin concepts of nature wherever and however they were manifested. I was able to pursue these issues initially through an EASA, European Association of Social Anthropology, conference session in Oslo in 1994, organized by Philippe Descolar and Gisli Paulsen. And thereafter, at a major international conference in Japan, organized with Katsuoshi Fukui. That's in 1992. And this all resulted in the publication a few years later in a book called Redefining Nature. And in both those outputs, I articulated how I thought we could reintegrate the social basis on which concepts of nature are constructed with the sort of cognitive imperatives that everywhere bring humans to think about the world around them in some similar ways. Basically, I argued that there was a tripartite basis to this shared social cognition. The thinginess of nature, its sort of entification, so to speak, generating recognition of numerous discrete types of organism. The evidence underpinning this was the pioneering work of Harold Conklin, Brent Berlin, and their successors working on ethnobiological classification. Then there was the otherness of nature. And this is really what the social anthropologists and the historians were most concerned about. The consistency with which the human mind contrasts itself with the outside other through myriad social cultural manifestations, of which something like culture is contrasted with something like nature, often mirrored in material changes humans themselves make to the environment. So it's not surprising that concepts of nature amongst people who intensively transform their environment through the creation of, say, irrigated rice terraces is rather different from those who interact with it directly as hunter-gatherers. Finally, there is nature as an essence or instinct, the compulsion to essentialize, as in the term natural, to see it as some kind of force. I've returned to these ideas and pursued them further in a recent book called Nature Wars, published in 2021. My thinking around the concept of nature brought together discussions on other matters that were current at the time. What do we mean by living things? The seemingly perennial debate about animism and everything else associated with what is sometimes called the ontological turn. And this has been developed in a number of other papers and presentations, many of which were included in that publication, Nature Wars. Another debate which has been integral to my work in ethnobiology has surrounded the very idea of indigenous knowledge, the appropriateness of this term and its uneasy relationship with the concept of science. This was first picked up in 2000 in a book I edited with the late Peter Parkes and Alan Bicker, Indigenous Environmental Knowledge and its Transformations. I had long been skeptical of the kind of green primitivism that simply asserted that, let us say, tropical rainforest peoples were, as it were, automatically guardians of the forest by virtue of their spirituality or way of life. It seemed to me that, as a generalization, this was implausible, given my own experience of Noholu environmental interactions. There had to be a more pragmatic explanation. For example, that preservation of the forest was an outcome of low demographic impact. At the same time, it was clear to me that certain cultural practices did indeed help to maintain biodiversity and deliver conservation objectives, both deliberately and inadvertently. Examples of these in the Nuaulu case were long forest fallow swidden cultivation cycles, and the forest reserves protected for the purpose of provisioning feasts and securing resources for ceremonial house building. Moreover, some of these so-called traditional strategies could be harnessed to the mitigation of modern ecological crises, an idea I followed through in a book published in 2007 called Modern Crises and Traditional Strategies. The work on Indigenous environmental knowledge and its transformations, and the sometimes fractious arguments between scientists and those defending and promoting the empirical knowledge of traditional peoples, energized me to look more closely at science itself as a discrete knowledge system, how it overlapped and contrasted with folk knowledge, and in particular, the circumstances of its historical origin, inevitably in the traditional preceding systems of knowledge. This led specifically to an essay presented at various venues, for example, at a British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, and which was eventually published in 2004 in the Journal of Cognition and Culture. The essay was called From Ethnoscience to Science, or What Indigenous Knowledge Debate Tells Us About How Scientists Define Their Project. In this paper, I examined the working lives of Carl Linnaeus and George Rumphius, who both self-consciously drew on folk knowledge of the early 18th century Swedish Sami, in the case of Linnaeus, and the late 17th century Indonesian Ambonese, in the case of Rumphius. The observations of Rumphius have become a continuing source of data and inspiration in my own attempts to make sense of Nuolu plant knowledge, and I've begun to look at the work of Rumphius himself through an anthropological and ethnoscientific lens in order to understand key ontological issues, such as what we might mean by a plant identification, something as simple as that. The reasons why Nuolu identify plants are not always the same as those of modern botanists, but Rumphius somehow serves as a bridge between those two cultural and ethnobotanical worlds. My current thinking on the relationship between local knowledge and the history of science has recently taken me in a somewhat different, maybe even radical direction. In particular, I have employed an anthropological perspective, especially drawing on research into cultural cognition, to shed light on debates in 19th century prehistory, which involved geologists and archaeologists struggling to identify human artifacts that might have preceded the well-defined hand axes accepted as human by 1859. This has involved looking at the reasoning behind what people judged at the time to be anthropic or non-anthropic, including how tools accepted as human might be elaborately classified and interpreted as so-called eoliths, and then unanimously rejected by a profession seeking to establish its scientific credentials. In turn, this links to the literature on what we mean by the word tool in the first place, and how non-modified objects are used as tools. This project was undertaken with an archaeologist, Angela Mutana, and an early key article was published significantly in the circumstances, I think, again in the Journal of Cognition and Culture. And that's the end of that section.